This political religion that we are talking about in Russia features this perception of the world, where there is, this holy Russia surrounded by the monsters, from the dark room in the child's imagination, and they try to fight those monsters. For them, Ukraine is occupied by those monsters temporarily, and essentially they want to liberate Ukraine from those monsters. That's how they think about things, like dream about things. But in reality, what they do, they just kill people. It's very plain. Just imagine, a paranoid and insane person fighting, those imagined monsters in a room. In his imagination, he is fighting monsters, but in effect, he's just destroying everything around him.
Well, hello. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring at least some amount of simplicity out of theological and historical complexity. And well, today that history is the history of the present. We're talking about the war in Ukraine, and I'm joined by the brilliant Dr. Cyril Havran, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest and scholar who is world-renowned for his work on political orthodoxy, political religion, and how orthodoxy has been weaponized, politicized, and ideologized, specifically under Putin. And he's working on a project of essentially trying to de-Putinize Orthodox religion. It's a fascinating conversation, and I think it sheds some real light on what is going on in Ukraine. Now, we make this distinction in the video, but I think it bears saying up front that when we talk about trying to make sense of what's going on in Ukraine, that in no way equates to justifying what is happening. It's merely saying that we are trying to understand what is motivating this senseless violence. When we can understand what is motivating someone, we can help better predict what they might do next, and also try to see what can we do in the future to prevent things like this. And well, that's the tenor of this conversation as we talk about everything from Soviet history to the kind of ideological vacuum that the Orthodox Church and its marriage with the state kind of filled after the fall of the USSR, and so much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hope you learn a lot. I know that I did. As with any other video that I make on this conflict in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine, let's be specific in our terminology there, this will not have YouTube ads on it, so you shouldn't have seen any at the beginning. You won't see any at the end. Instead, it will feature a fundraiser, which will be for food to people facing crisis in Ukraine. And if you feel so led to help them out, I would encourage you to do so by clicking that link. Thank you all for your time. I hope this video blesses you, and here it is. Well, today I'm joined by Archimandrite Cyril Havran. Archimandrite Cyril Havran is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at St. Ignatius in Sweden. He is originally from Ukraine, where he first began his studies in theoretical physics before moving to the study of theology at the Theological Seminary and Academy in Kyiv. He continued theological education at the National and Kapodistrian University. There we go, of Athens and Durham in the United Kingdom, where he defended his PhD under the supervision of Professor Father Andrew Louth. The topic of his thesis was related to the post-Chalcedonian Christology. He is also the author of multiple books, including, most relevant for today, Political Orthodoxies and Ukrainian Public Theology. Dr. Havran, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Austin, for inviting me.
Oh, it is my pleasure as well, most certainly. I wish it was under different circumstances. I wish we were speaking of different things, but I'm very honored to have you on to talk about some of the pressing issues facing our world today, specifically as it relates to the Orthodox Church and theology, as I know many of my viewers will be interested in. So once again, thank you, and I'll preface this with, in a lot of my interviews, I'm talking about things that I feel like I have a pretty good amount of background knowledge on. And I will readily admit that I am out of my league with this conversation. And so I'm very grateful just for your wisdom and insight in this. And I'm excited to learn today, as I hope my audience will as well. So I'd like to start with a brief history of Russian political religion, specifically in the post-Soviet era. I think this is going to be helpful to maybe try to, and I have to be careful here the way I say this, when I say make sense of what's going on, not in the sense of any way justifying what's going on, but trying to develop a mental model maybe for how we
exactly.
make sense of this.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, I think it's a great, I
well,
think it's a great question indeed, and it's very up to the point that it's important to frame the events, this war, in some kind of methodological frame, if you want, kind of mental, intellectual frame that may help to understand what is going on. Because, well, everyone sees the pictures, everyone sees the horrors, and indeed, it's impossible to make sense, to explain why it is happening. And I think there is an explanation. And you are absolutely right by indicating that there is a political religion that underpins this war. And indeed, we need properly to explain what is this, what is political religion. And I need to say that this term has been coined in Europe in the interwar period when both Nazism and communism were on rise, and they were identified at that time as political religions. However, different they were, still they belong to the same kind of category of political religions as they were defined. And essentially, political religion means that it is an ideological system with a set of ideas and programs how to improve, the humankind and how to bring a brighter future. Imagine Nazism and communism both dreamed of a brighter future for the humankind. They differed in the method. I mean, they differed in the. They were actually very similar in the methods. By extinguishing groups of people. That's what was their way of towards a brighter future. But what they differed in was what kind of groups of people they wanted to exterminate. Like the Nazism wanted to exterminate Jews and different minorities, people with disabilities, essentially all people that did not fit the criterion of of the pure race of Aryans. The communists wanted to exterminate another group of people, what we now call middle class, what we now call even upper classes of the society. They wanted to free the space, so to say, for the lower classes to dominate. That's how they defined what they called the dictatorship of the proletarians. So they were similar in their aspiration for a better future for the humankind. They were similar in their methods, meaning extermination of groups of people, and they differed in the way how they identified what kind of people they wanted to exterminate, and they also shared in the way how they treated religion. Communism was, as we know, very much against any religion. It was a militant atheism that it professed. It envisaged communist ideology, envisaged a future for the humankind free of any religion. That was the dream. And as for Nazism, it didn't like religion either, but it certainly used this idea that, well, communists want to exterminate religion, we want to protect it somehow. But this sort of protection of religion was rather an instrumentalization of religion. They actually wanted religion to serve them, to serve the Nazi ideology. That's why they organized, groups of Christians, and they tried to persuade groups of Christians, like in the countries like Germany, to consolidate themselves around the Nazi ideology. That's how they formed the groups like Deutsche Christen, the German Christians, which was essentially a kind of quasi-church, almost a church, but it was essentially more like a political party supporting the Nazi ideology. So that is kind of the frame in which political religion emerged. And both groups, Nazis and communists, they try to consolidate masses. They try to persuade masses to believe them, to subscribe to their ideas, to their ideologies by offering some kind of rights, some kind of quasi-religious motivation for the people. They functioned, they acted as churches, as religions per se. Imagine communism being like a sort of religion. even though communism was against any religion, but it replaced religion and played a role of a religion. The same was with Nazism. Nazism, for those who believed in Nazism, was a sort of religion. Yes, they could be Christians in a sense, now of course we can question what kind of Christians they were, but they professed themselves as Christians at least, and at the same time they believed in Nazism as a sort of another religion. So this is basically the idea of political religion. It functions as a quasi-church, as a religion, but it serves political purposes, and it primarily supports an ideology. Also, the feature of political religion is that it is coercive. This makes it a political religion different from the civil religion. Civil religion is a sort of slightly different, well, quite fundamentally different, I would say, even though it appears to be slightly different from political religion, because civil religion also implies some kind of cults, civic cults. When people come together and they perform some rites together. Like the best example of that is American civil religion. It has been described, by prominent sociologists as a distant phenomenon. So when people, demonstrate their allegiance to the American flag. They participate, in the procession. They sing together. They do together things that constitute essentially sort of a system of rights of American civil religion. And also the idea of the civil religion is to preserve the cohesions, the cohesion, the kind of coherence of the people, to unite them around an idea. Well, in this case, in the case of the American civil religion, is the idea of freedom. That's what people feel being united for. So one may ask the question, what is the difference then between the civil religion and political religion? I believe that the main difference is that civil religion is voluntarily. It requires the consent of the people, while political religion is violent and it's coercive. So essentially, it's like the difference, between the TV commercials, they encourage you to buy things right on TV. In the case of the civil religion, but they don't force you to buy things. Essentially, the idea of the civil religion is to encourage you to subscribe to the ideas of the civil religion without forcing you to do that. The political religion is different. It's when you are forced, you don't have other choice but to buy this product. Or to subscribe to a particular ideology and to follow a particular line. That is the basic kind of difference. So now when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, I think one can explain the relationship between Ukraine and Russia also in the terms of civil and political religion. In Russia, after the fall of communism, there was a kind of political and ideological void, emptiness, when the communist ideology was gone and the Russian people didn't have anything to believe in, essentially. So what the church came up with was a sort of civil religion, which would combine, the elements of the Orthodox Christianity, also of the, kind of communist ideology, very kind of watered down, and some ideas from the pre-communist era, from the imperial era of the Russian Empire, Romanov's Empire. So that was a very strange mix of ideas, and originally this ideology functioned as a civil religion. So no one was forced to subscribe to it, no one was to believe in it, but it was kind of offered as a substitute for the communist ideology. But very soon, this civil religion changed into a more violent form, the form of political religion. I believe this happened in 2012. You probably remember this episode with Pussy Riot punk band, a female band that performed in a church in Moscow in 2012. And for that performance, they were punished, with imprisonment, with the support of the church. The church actually endorsed this kind of sentence to that group. And I think that's when the transformation of the Russian civil religion happened to the political religion. And since then, now for 10 years, it has been evolving as a political religion and reached its ultimate, the most violent kind of apotheosis peak in this war in Ukraine. So what we are dealing with in Ukraine, I believe, is essentially a form of a very violent political religion of sorts that existed in Europe in the interwar period in the forms of Nazism and fascism.
Thank you for that. There's a lot there, and I want to try to unpack a little bit of it for some people who these might be new ideas. So, in kind of like the broadest strokes outline, and I got this from your book as well, Political Orthodoxies, which I would really recommend to people, is that kind of after the fall of the USSR, there's this vacuum, kind of a propaganda or even a
Exactly.
ideological vacuum, and then the Orthodox Church comes to inhabit that vacuum with this new first civil religion, and then what becomes a political religion.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
I think that that's a helpful kind of way of framing the history there and understanding
Mm-hmm.
maybe what kind of, in some sense, motivates Russian culture, of course, at a very broad, general level. But could you help me make that connection a little more to what's going on in Ukraine there? Because I think for a lot of my viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with the dynamics of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and
Yeah.
in Russia, they might say, well, why would that inspire kind of this invasion of Ukraine? Aren't they also Orthodox?
Yeah.
Is it to unite
Yeah.
the Orthodox Church? Is it because the Orthodox churches are separate there? Could you kind of drill into that a bit to help
Yeah.
people understand that?
Yeah. Yeah. Also, this is a very good question, and it is needed to be answered to understand better what is going on. Indeed, well, from the perspective of the political religion that emerged in Russia, this religion presented the global kind of scene in the terms of Russia being a distinct civilization and being imposed upon or intruded by the West. So, from this perspective, the West appears to be like a unified force. So to say, well, of course, those who live in the West cannot imagine the West being unified around, well, actually, many things. It seems to be really divided and fragmented. But from the perspective of Russia, the West comes up as a unified front. Uh, uh, and its purpose is the only one to conquer Russia. I believe that this is essentially a projection of Russia's own kind of desires and fears of conquering. And it is like a sort of projection of Russia upon the West. Essentially, people like Putin think of the West in terms of their own political culture, of their own political thinking. They perceive themselves as conquerors, and they are afraid that because the West is stronger, is more powerful, it wants to take over Russia. And essentially, from the Russian perspective, what is happening in Ukraine is not an aggression; it is a protection, it is defense. Quite paradoxically, so they see themselves as defending themselves against a completely imagined enemy. Essentially, yes, we should say that their enemies are completely, it exists only in their own heads. It doesn't exist in reality. And still they fight it. And I would call this enemy. There is a French phrase, a French word, la tarasque. La tarasque is like a monster. Those monsters that children imagine when they are alone in the darkness in their room, and they imagine those monsters coming to them. And of course, we know those monsters don't exist, but for the children, they do exist. Or like in this movie, Monster Academy, that's exactly a sort of things that Putin lives in. The world of Putin is the world of those monsters. It is a very childish world, certainly. That's why, well, he is not a mature personality as a personality, and he still lives in the world of monsters, imagined monsters, and he fights those monsters. So essentially, yes, this political religion that we are talking about in Russia features uh, this perception of the world, where there is, this holy Russia surrounded by the monsters, from the dark room in the child's imagination, and they try to fight those monsters. For them, Ukraine is occupied by those monsters temporarily, and essentially they want to liberate Ukraine from those monsters. That's how they think about things, like dream about things. But in reality, what they do, they just kill people. It's very plain. Just imagine, a paranoid and insane person fighting, those imagined monsters in a room. In his imagination, he is fighting monsters, but in effect, he's just destroying everything around him. And that's the reality. Yes, and I believe, to perceive the world in these terms, holy ruse against the monsters, one has to have a very insane imagination, and at the same time an imagination affected by religion. And my argument would be that this is not a healthy religion that they practice, not a healthy metaphysics they are driven by, but it is an unhealthy metaphysics. This is a distortion of religion. This is a distortion of the tradition they pretend to profess and to protect. And that's why I believe their distorted perception of religion, of the world, needs to be addressed from the perspective of healthy religion, not just from the perspective of secularism, not just, say, okay, get rid of this religion, it kills people again. No, it will not work. What will work is to try to correct this worldview, unhealthy, insane worldview, from the perspective of healthy religion. That's what we try to do with my colleagues by deconstructing, Putinism as a sort of deviation of Christianity, and we try to do it from the perspective of our own tradition. I believe it provides us with a lot of resources, healthy resources, to deconstruct this monster, which is Putin's religion and Putin's worldview.
I'm fascinated by that idea of deconstructing Putinism, and I think you're absolutely right that and you didn't say this, but you're right that secularism isn't the answer. And I think the reflex in the West is to look at the way in which Orthodoxy has maybe been weaponized or politicized by Putin and think, well, okay, that's the answer. If we can just kind of replace that with maybe a more secular Enlightenment worldview, everything will be great. But that seems to fundamentally misunderstand this idea of what Putin believes about the world, because that's exactly what they're fighting against, right? Or at least perceived fighting against.
Exactly. It will just add oil to fire if you try to deal with it with Putinism in this way.
Yes, and that's why I'm so excited to have you on to talk about this. As there's many ways and many angles at which you could talk about this conflict, and many of them are fruitful, but I think being able to address the kind of religious implications, especially as someone with a background in ecclesiology, is just so important here. I want to maybe just give a second to hone in on that idea you were talking about. When you were talking about Holy Mother Russia against the world, it seemed to me to be pretty closely parallel to what seems to be a more technical term that you bring up in your work, called the Russian world, and how do we interpret the Russian world. And ultimately it seems that one of the goals is to show that ideology of the Russian world is essentially bankrupt, or it doesn't align with reality. Now, in an article that you wrote on interpreting the Russian world, and I believe at this time you were talking about the conflict in Crimea, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. You write, the conflict in Ukraine is indeed a civil conflict, but not between the people of the Ukrainian state as the Russian propaganda presents it, but between the people who fall under the formal criteria of the, quote, Russian world, and yet they fight and kill each other. One side does so in the name of the Russian world, while the other side because they refuse to identify themselves with the Russian world. This proves that the Russian world is an imaginary community shaped by an ideology that divides people and inspires them to kill each other. To stop the fighting in eastern Ukraine, and I would imagine we would say now in all of Ukraine, and to reconcile the divided people of the country, the concept of the Russian world should be dismantled. Could you walk us through this a bit? Because I think some people, they might identify with that idea of, okay, fighting monsters, this isn't helpful. But specifically the Russian world, it seems to get into maybe another even deeper idea. But I'll let you talk about how that's important.
Yeah, good. It's also another good side of the question that needs to be explained, indeed. You can describe the political religion that we were talking about in different ways, and the Russians themselves, they don't describe this political religion as a political religion. They describe it as the Russian world idea. That is their term. And that is the concept which has been developed and actually named in this way by the primate of the Russian Church, Patriarch Kirill himself, who is kind of the proponent of the ideology, the main proponent, I would argue. And the concept of the Russian world is quite complex. It includes a lot of elements in a very kind of somehow chaotic systematic way, I would say. So you can see there, you can discern there the elements of the political religions that I mentioned. You can discern there a sort of metaphysics that I already mentioned that can be, observed in Putin's mind. It also features some elements of the Western culture wars. If you take the American situation, the culture wars in the United States between the, Republicans and Democrats, and those who the choicers and the pro-life movement. Or people who are in support of LGBT community, people who are strongly against it. Those culture wars, they are also a part of the Russian world ideology. They have become a part of this ideology, and I usually explain to my students that the culture wars are neither about culture nor about war. But in the case of Ukraine and Russia, a culture war has become a real war. It came very close to become a real war in the United States with the events a year ago on 6th of January, when the crowds tried to storm the Capitol. That was another kind of instance, I believe, of a culture war on the American soil. But this element of the culture wars in the agenda of the Russian world makes it attractive to many people outside the Russian world. That's why a lot of kind of people in different conservative groups in the United States, religious groups like white evangelicals, not all of them, but some of them, quite a considerable number of them, or conservative Catholics or Pentecostals would subscribe to Putin's agenda, even would support him, and they certainly, many of them openly supported Putin. Well, at least before the war. Hopefully, they will stop doing this after the war, in the wake of the war. But I mean, this aspect, culture of the culture wars, makes the purely Russian kind of thing, project, geopolitical project, attractive to many people beyond the Russian world. And now it also alienates people within the Russian Orthodox community, or the Orthodox community. Indeed, as you quoted correctly my piece, and I still argue for that, most people who fight on both sides in the war, even now, they are Orthodox Christians. If they have any religion, it's the Orthodox Christianity, right? And imagine people kill each other, even though in the past, that it might be that they participated in communion together in the same congregation, the same community. They would have approached the same chalice, and now they kill each other. And the question is why? They are not different in religion. They are not different in in the way how they see God. Why then they kill each other? And my answer to this is because a part of this religion of Orthodox Christianity has been indeed infected, intoxicated by the ideology of the Russian world. Essentially, that is the component that adds to religion, that makes this a part of this religion, or a part of the people who subscribe to this religion, alienated to other parts of the people. And that indicates exactly how toxic can be the ideologization of religion. I call it politicization of religion. You may call it the kind of, well, the other way around. Sometimes I say we are speaking about the ideologization of theology. We can also talk about theologization of ideology, when ideology, as a purely secular construct of ideology, gets vested, gets dressed in theological terms, in theological language. Both kind of phenomena, they are approximately the same, and they are dangerous. That's why another kind of thing that I suggest as a proposal to disarm the ideology of the Russian world is to de-theologize ideology, or to de-ideologize theology. That is my project of Putin and deputinization of the Russian church and Russian society, which I think is needed, and it can be like a solution, a key to how to deal with the situation after the war. Because after the war, we need to do something about the reasons that had led to the war in the first place. And I think it is important at the stage after the war to proceed to a very systematic, thoroughful deputinization of the Russian social and religious life.
I want to kind of double click on that idea of deputinizing. the Russian religious life. I'm all for it, and it seems so important. And you highlight that idea of people who could commune at the same chalice now killing each other. And what does that? It has to be that there's something above this, right? Because the religion should be uniting them, but there has been this politicization that
Indeed.
has been so potent to allow something like this. What does it look like to begin to de-Putinize Orthodox Christianity in Russia? How would one go about doing that? I know it's not an easy project, but I know it's something you're committed to. So what does that look like?
Yes, it has started already, and we are working on this with some colleagues of mine. Probably you may be aware about the declaration that denounced the Russian world ideology. Was drafted by some prominent Orthodox theologians and signed by a considerable number of other theologians. Yes, this project presupposes, first of all, we need to really analyze the Russian world ideology, and we really need to separate what is theological in this ideology and what is ideological, what is political. This is a very intellectual kind of effort. We need to do intellectual work, pretty much, of distinguishing between the political and theological elements in the ideology, and then certainly we need to deconstruct. I mean, not just to distinguish intellectually, but actually almost physically to separate the elements of theology and ideology from each other. We need to articulate clearly what is wrong about this ideology from the perspective of the Orthodox theology, of the Orthodox tradition, and maybe even to condemn the wrong element in political theology of the Russian world. This suggestion has been done by the theologians, and they really want to proceed to very radical steps of condemning a new heresy of the Russian world. They render the Russian world as a heresy, and they argue that, and this is also my argument, that the Russian world is essentially a continuation of the old heresy, which had been condemned as early as in 1872 at the council in Constantinople. It was condemned as known as tribalism. In Greek, they call it philetism. So it's tribalism. It's essentially the idea that if you belong to a tribe, right, and you believe that this tribe has a special mission from God, then you can do whatever you want. You are exempted, from laws, from rules, and things. And then what kind of the other thing is how you define your tribe. You can define your tribe as a nation, like ethnos, and that's how we go to nationalism, and that's why nationalism is something which is to be rejected from, well, at least from the perspective of my tradition. Also, you can go as far as to identify a tribe with a civilization. That's exactly what Putin does. He defines his own tribe in the terms of a global Russian civilization. That is his name for the Russian world. It's nothing more than just another extended form of tribalism. And this is wrong, and this needs to be condemned on the premises that already existed in our tradition. So that's another kind of way to deal with this in terms of deconstructing the Russian world ideology.
I don't know if this gets too far afield, but when you bring up that idea of philetism, it's something that I know has been a hot issue in the comment sections of my videos at times. I've got a very diverse audience of Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants. And one concern that a lot of non-Orthodox seem to have with the Orthodox Church is this very idea that so on the one hand, philetism has been condemned as heresy. And what was that, 1872 at Constantinople, you said?
That's correct.
On the other hand, I think for a lot of outsiders looking in, they say, it seems like the Orthodox Church in at least the modern world has been built around national churches, which seems to lead to this idea. I wonder how maybe we can distinguish those two ideas, or maybe they don't need to be distinguished. Maybe you think both are bad. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because I could hear some people saying, well, for instance, if I walk down the street here in Chicago, I can walk right past an OCA church, which is loosely affiliated with America and Russia, I suppose. And then maybe 2 blocks from it is a Greek Orthodox church, and maybe
And
not
of
too
course, you
far
have
of
a
a.
Ukrainian village in Chicago, a
Yes,
huge
we
Ukrainian
do.
community.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think some people would say, well, how do we distinguish those ideas? Because it seems like the church has been built around these national identities. Could you help me with that a little bit there?
Absolutely, yes. There should be a very clear differentiation between the healthy national identity and unhealthy national identity. Just like with theology, there is a healthy theology and unhealthy theology. Um, on the one hand, we speak about patriotism as a healthy phenomenon. Patriotism is essentially when you respect your own identity, when you respect your own nation, which is absolutely fine because, well, it fits the God's plan about humankind. That's why we are human beings are separated to those ethnic groups after all, and it's not without reason. So one thing is when you respect your own identity, but you also respect other ethnic identities and groups. That is about patriotism. It's not about hatred. It's about respect, and it's about receiving others as your partners, as your counterparts. And another thing is nationalism. Essentially, nationalism is different because nationalism is about exempting yourself among others. When you respect your identity to the extent that you begin reject the identity of others, when you endorse your own identity at the expense of degrading the identity of others. I think, well, I doubt that at that time, President Trump, when he said that he's a nationalist, he really understood the definition of nationalism. But probably he was right when he declared himself a national, because that sort of nationalism was exactly what I described. It was at the expense of others, make America great again by degrading or diminishing others. That is exactly the nature of nationalism, and this is something that needs to be condemned from the religious perspective. So, to summarize, patriotism is good. It's good to be patriot. It's good to be respecting your identity. It's good, but as far as you respect other identities as well, the moment you stop respecting others and exaggerate your own what you are as a nation, at that moment it turns into a very unhealthy and to a very dangerous, I think, thing that may lead to the situation that we have in Ukraine now, because exactly that is the point of the Russian war. They say we are unique because we are Orthodox. We hold the truth without any compromise. We stand for the traditional values, the values of the family, Christian morality. Others, like the West, they have fallen, they have compromised those values, Christian values, even if they are Orthodox, like in Ukraine, because they align with the ideas of of democracy, of freedom. For the Russians, it's a compromise of their faith. That's why they are inferior to us. That's why we are eligible to fight them and even to kill them. That is essentially the driving force of this war. It stems from exactly this sort of nationalism, exceptionism that the Russians have.
Thank you for that. I think that's going to be broadly applicable for people and very helpful, whether they're thinking about Philitism in the Orthodox Church, whether they're thinking about the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, or they're just reflecting on some of the major conversations that have been going on in the West, generally speaking.
Or in the United States.
Yeah.
I think it is very applicable to the American situation.
It certainly is, of this line that we're trying to distinguish between, which I think is oh so important, between you're allowed to love your country. That's not what people are saying when we're condemning nationalism, and being able to make that distinction in such a way that doesn't feel threatening to so many people, because I having entered into these conversations with people, or having watched these conversations happen often in the least productive ways, right, and on Facebook comment sections or wherever, you see people feeling that when they hear that nationalism is bad, which I fully agree with, they feel as though people are telling them that means they can't love their country. But I think it gets to that idea of exceptionalism there, which is so important and so dangerous. As we see, when you have that sense of the religious and the moral high ground, you can begin to justify so many things and it becomes very, very dangerous, as we're seeing in just gruesome fashion. I want to shift here just a little bit to this idea of Occidentalism, which you talk about in some of your work, which has, I think, been in the background of what we've been talking about throughout this conversation, with this idea of the boogie monster West kind of trying to infringe upon the East there. But I want to, and maybe I say that with too much jest there, because I want to be sensitive to the fact that I do have people that are attracted to this idea, as you've said, and be able to kind of show with reason and theological care why this isn't helpful. Whether these people come from Russia, I recognize I have a global audience, but also, like you said, kind of conservative Christians can be allured by this idea of this holy Russia that's trying to remain pure. And I think that begins to be consolidated in this idea of Occidentalism, of the Holy East, and maybe that gets shrunk all the way down to Russia versus the godless, pagan, secular West. Now, this seems to also have not only kind of secular overtones of they believe in democracy and freedom and that's going to hurt our religion, but also seems to be something that runs very deep in the Orthodox Church, of seeing, maybe at its worst, in fairness, I don't want to say, at its best it has this, but seeing everything that is Western being bad, even to its most extreme of like someone like Augustine, someone who might be considered a church father because he's Western, is now, kind of automatically bad. Talk to me about this idea.
That's why, for example, sorry.
No,
that's exactly why those who are opposing the West in the East, even brilliant theologians, really bright people, they, for example, believe that Augustine is the reason of all Western evils. They even believe, that Augustine is to be blamed for Western secularism. So it's really kind of impossible to accept from the historical perspective. Yes, it's a very good question again, and indeed, this East-West divide, which is a completely constructed, imagined thing. It's not a reality. It's an imagination. It's another Latarask, another monster that comes out of one's mind. Is underpinned by a very specific religious worldview. In the past, in the history of Christianity, this worldview has been identified as Gnostic, as Manichaean, because it was pertinent. It was adopted by the groups of Gnostics and Manichaeans, and they saw the world exactly in black and white, and has divided into two parts. One part is, intrinsically, ontological, essentially good, and another part as ontological, essentially bad, regardless of what they do. They are destined, to be good and bad. It's a very ancient kind of world way of seeing the world. It's not Christian. Christianity tried to overcome this worldview through the patristic writings. Some brilliant theologians, especially like Irenaeus of Lyon, for example, a great theologian of the past. He very successfully rebuked this kind of worldview, and he argued that the entire world is the creation of God. The world is good. You cannot say, if you say that a part of this world is intrinsically, essentially bad, you don't believe in God, essentially, in the omnipotence of God. You doubt God, essentially, that God is able to create, an entirely good thing, entirely good world. So essentially, the Gnostic worldview is a result of weak faith, I believe. As a result of a perception of the world that sees the world as, or sees the God as not capable enough, not powerful enough to create an entirely good world. And they believe that the parts of the world have been affected by evil so deeply that they need to be either destroyed or, rebuilt from the scratch. Essentially, this worldview underpins the Russian perception of, Putin's and his confederates, a perception of the world. They see the world in black and white. They see the world. They see Russia as intrinsically good, and they see the West, especially the United States, as the incarnation of the cosmic evil. One can be reminded in this point, of the perception how radical Muslims who back, Daesh, the Islamic State, and and things like that see the world. They see the world in exactly the same terms, in black and white. And for them, the United States is like a global shaitan, demonic, force in the world, and which needs to be eliminated. That's why they come and blast and Twin Towers and do all these terroristic attacks on the United States. They are underpinned by the same dualistic Manichaean worldview that the Russian president has, and essentially the way how to deal with this, I believe, it's again not by rejecting religion as such, but by imposing, an orthodox with a small o, not just the identity thing, but the kind of orthodox way of seeing things. And the orthodox way of Christianity is exactly to see the world as it is, as a good thing, as the creation of God, as not as divided into black and white parts of it. Also, I want to say that this dualistic worldview is very easy intellectually to practice. If you want, it's a sort of conspiracy theory. We know that conspiracy theories, they are very easy to conceive and to believe in. That's why they are so popular, because they don't require much effort, intellectual effort. So basically, this conspiracy theory says, you see, we are kind of Russians, we are good people here, and the rest of the world, primarily the United States, conspire against us. They want to destroy us, and they do whatever we can imagine, or maybe we don't even imagine what they try to do to us. And they firmly believe that there is a huge, anti-Russian conspiracy in the world, and they essentially try to protect themselves. It's paranoid. It's intellectually kind of very weak, as any conspiracy theory is weak. But that's the reality. That's what they believe. So they essentially they have a very deficient worldview. They are driven by fear. They are driven by those imagined monsters that they produce themselves, imagine themselves, and they are desperate to fight them. And as a result, we have this war in Ukraine.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that's going to be helpful for people, even if it might strike a nerve with some people, which often the things that strike a nerve are helpful, because I think my channel has tended to attract a lot of people who maybe grew up evangelical and became Orthodox or Catholic, and I think specifically for a lot of those that became Orthodox, part of taking on that Orthodox identity was becoming anti-Western, right? Defining oneself by what they are not anymore, at least in their own perception of, hey, I used to be this evangelical Protestant, but then I realized that Western theology is bad and Eastern theology is good. And now I want to be fair and say that for many of them, they're more nuanced. But I think for a lot of people, that is what happens.
And I think it is good to answer to this question. I mean, to address this issue, because I believe this is a wrong perception of Orthodoxy. If they came to Orthodoxy for those reasons, it's kind of a wrong destination, because Orthodoxy is not about West-East divide. Orthodoxy, well, it was born in the time when there was a global Roman Empire, and when there was no divide between East and West. And Orthodoxy actually was formed, the Orthodox theology was formed as free of this East-West divide. It came to the Orthodox Church much later, and it is essentially intrinsically a dualistic perception of the Church. I think it is a kind of the remnant of the Gnostic legacy in Christianity, and this legacy is not healthy. That's why I think, regardless of the war, regardless of what we are talking about, Russia, it's important in the Orthodox Church, within the Orthodox Church, as it is important within the Catholic Church or evangelical churches, I think to chase out this idea of easy answers to complicated questions, to chase out the idea of this dualism, the conspiracy theories, this kind of really intellectually very weak polarization, dichotomization between us good and them bad, us Orthodox Easterners against them heretical Westerners. This is kind of a wrong, I would say, take on Orthodoxy. And the people who want to be really mature in their Christianity, they certainly need to overcome this kind of worldview and perception.
Yes, I think that is such a needed thing, and I understand how it happens. Like you said, these are easy answers, and kind of like a soundbite culture. These work, right? For apologetics, they have those short-term gains of giving people this model that seems very easy, but then doesn't actually hold up with reality, and ultimately,
Exactly.
I don't think is helpful. And I think it's worth saying as we talk about those dualisms that, at least from my perspective, and I imagine you would agree, but that when we talk about this conflict as well, we want to be careful to distinguish maybe between Putin and his kind of confederates and the people that are guiding that Russian world ideology, and people who are simply living in Russia and very well may not support this war at all. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush to say that everyone living within the geographical bounds of Russia believes the exact things we've talked about and wants to support this in this way. And so I think that's important.
Yeah, that would be another easy kind of answer to the complicated question. The easy answer would be, well, all those Russians are are bad, and they are killers, murderers, and so forth. No, it's not true. That is a very easy and almost another conspiracy theory, if you want, now against Russians, painting all of them in the same hue, in the same colors. No, I know Russians who are very strongly against the war, and they have sane attitude to what Putin is doing. They are very much anti-Putin. The same I would say about many people in the Russian Orthodox Church, whom I know, and they are against the war, against what even the leadership of the church is doing. Well, unfortunately, I should say that probably the majority are either passively or actively supporting Putin in Russia. That's another very sad truth. But not all of them, still. And we need to be careful to distinguish between those who are for Putin, for this war, and those who are against.
Yes, thank you for that. Maybe this is my evangelicalism talking, maybe it's my Western pragmatism or my generational activism. I don't know, but I always like to try to end my interviews by giving people a concrete next step they can take to maybe try to move things slightly in a better direction. And I want to give you the opportunity to speak directly maybe to my Orthodox followers who can maybe most directly participate in what you talk about of this de-ideologization of theology, or the de-theologization of ideology. What can people going away from this interview do to help maybe move the Orthodox Church in the smallest of ways in a direction that helps prevent conflicts like these from happening again?
Yeah. Absolutely. So, well, I believe we in the Eastern Christian traditions are, in fact, quite well prepared to deal with this sort of, issues, because in our history we had everything, both good and bad things. We had a complete affiliation with the Roman Empire, to the extent that we completely, aligned ourselves with the imperial agendas and projects. But before that, we had an amazing history of nonconformism and counterculturalism, in the sense that we withstood the pressure of the pagan Roman Empire. Christians learned how to live without being affected by politics, which was very unusual for the Greco-Roman world, because it was given of the Greco-Roman world that religion and politics were intertwined. They were unthinkable separate, to be separate from each other. Religion and politics, usually, it was the rule, constituted one thing. And only Christianity, when Christianity came to this world, Jesus Christ, when came, he made this revolution. I would call it the revolution of nonconformism, when Jesus Christ essentially introduced the idea that religion can be, stand separately from politics, can be separated from politics. And since then, I think we have had this ideal. So I believe that it is crucial for Christians, regardless whether it is Orthodox Christian or evangelical or Catholic Christians, to remember this kind of Jesus's revolution against the basic principles of the Greek and Roman world, against this principle, cuius regio eius religio, whoever rules, that person dictates the religion, which is imposed upon the subjects. So Jesus essentially said, no, it's up to you, up to your personal choice, what kind of religion you want. And that choice has the ultimate value in the eyes of God. Because if you choose your religion. That is your choice. And that choice has the value for God. And that choice has not to be conditioned by culture wars, by political agendas, by ideologies. It's deeply inside human soul, human mind, that the choice has to be made, not in the line, in the line with any politics or any ideology. That would be kind of my conclusion, if you want, which I think could be relevant for all confessions and Christian groups.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that this isn't the first time, and regrettably, most likely will not be the last time that Christians marry religion and politics. And I think I absolutely agree that that is the ideal in the Christian faith there. But for skeptical outsiders looking in who want to point back at history of the many times this has happened, I want to say, yeah, I own that as Christians, we have not always gotten this right. But by God's grace, hopefully, we can do better. Well, Dr. Havaran, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an absolute privilege for me, and I think this will really bless people. If you don't mind, I'd like to close, as I always do on this channel, by asking 4 questions that kind of help people get to know the guest on maybe a little more personal level, as the conversations on this channel can tend to be very heady and intellectual, and this certainly had a lot of depth. And I don't mean to bring these on to bring undue levity to a serious conversation, but I think people would appreciate to get to hear these things. So the first question is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Well, I would say the most, a very important thing of my kind of religious practice, if you want, has been Jesus prayer, which is very important in the Eastern Christianity. When we repeat the name of Jesus, I think it is kind of, it's a very important thing. I believe, and it can be practiced by anyone, by any Christian. As a matter of fact, it's not just for the Orthodox, and it's very easy to practice. It's the easiest prayer that one can imagine, and it's very helpful.
Yes, I love that. I read The Way of the Pilgrim, I believe, a year or so ago, and
exactly,
really opened my eyes to that. So I love it. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
It's also a good question. Actually, I would not identify a single book. The Bible is the most important book, certainly. Through the Bible, I came to faith. I read pieces of the gospel in the time when the gospel was not available as a book in the late Soviet era, and by reading excerpts from the gospel, which were published in a scientific magazine. Imagine how it happened in the Soviet Union. That's how I converted eventually. But other texts, I believe, yes, what we call the fathers of the church, the patristic literature, it has been the most important source after the Bible for me.
Very well. That sounds like a fascinating conversion story. I'd love to hear that one day. You're having coffee with your undergrad or early grad school self. What's one piece of advice you give him for his future in theology?
Yes, because I teach to different students in different contexts, like in the United States, in Europe, even in China, in Asia. It depends with whom I have this conversation. Certainly, I would certainly advise people to use their rationality to analyze, to check their faith. I like this saying, it's very simple, maybe even simplistic, that you need to engage both your mind and your heart in your faith, in your theology. So the mind in theology without heart leads you to a heresy. The heart without mind leads you to wrong spiritual feelings. So one has to probably avoid both extremes and to put together heart and mind.
Wonderful. And the final question that I ask all of my guests is it revolves around the fact that my channel is called Gospel Simplicity, yet the conversations can often become very complex, leading people to ask if I'll ever change the name to Gospel Complexity, which I answer with a resounding never. But in a sentence or so, what is the gospel?
Yes, I like the title of your program, Gospel Simplicity. I think it is, well, gospel is about simplicity. I believe God is very simple, and that is a theological maxim. God is simple. God is not complex, and this applies also to our life. Christian belief, I believe, is about simplicity, but it's about humbleness, and gospel is, if you want, is the ultimate expression, manifestation of humbleness, of the divine humbleness.
Wonderful. Dr. Halvaran, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a privilege. Thank you to everyone who watches this sometime in the future. I appreciate your time as well. But Dr. Halvaran, really, I know this is such a heavy and pressing and personal topic, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
All the best. May God bless you and your audience.
Yes. God bless.